My son graduated from medical school on a Thursday in May. I wasn't there to see him walk across the stage. Not because I was sick, not because I forgot. Because his fiancée, Celeste, told the security guard at the door that I wasn't on the guest list, and my son, Dr. Adrian Moss, let it happen. I stood outside Hartwell Auditorium in my good navy dress, the one I had bought at Belk 3 years ago for my church friend's retirement party. I stood there while other families streamed past me in their silk blouses and tailored blazers, clutching bouquets and balloons that said Dositor in gold letters. I stood there while a young security guard in his 20s looked at his clipboard, looked at me, and said, "Ma'am, I'm sorry. Your name isn't here." I said nothing. I turned around and walked back to my car. I sat in the parking lot for 22 minutes. I know because I watched the clock on the dashboard. Then I drove home to my apartment on Clover Street, changed out of my good dress, put on my work uniform, and went in for my shift at Meridian Memorial Hospital, not as a doctor. As the woman who mops the floors in the ICU between midnight and 6 in the morning. That was the night I decided things needed to change. Not for me. For my son, before it was too late to save him from the woman he was about to marry. I want to tell you something first, before any of the rest of this makes sense. My name is Nora Moss. I am 63 years old. I have been a hospital custodian for 27 years. I work the overnight shift, which means I am invisible to most of the people whose lives I help keep clean. Doctors walk past me in the hall without looking up. Nurses step around my cart without breaking conversation. Patients see me as part of the furniture. I know this. I have known it for a long time. It stopped stinging somewhere around year 8. What I did not advertise, what I did not discuss with anyone at work or in my building or even at my church, was that I also owned 11 commercial properties across 3 counties, a strip mall in Claiborne, 2 medical office buildings in Hardin Falls, a small apartment complex in Ridgeway, others, all held under a company called NLM Holdings, my initials, all managed by a property firm I'd been using since 2001. All generating income I had been quietly reinvesting since before Adrian started kindergarten. I had started buying real estate the same way I had started everything in my life. Slowly, carefully, without telling a single person. In 1997, I overheard 2 administrators at the hospital talking about a foreclosed medical office building on Prentice Avenue. The previous owner had gone bankrupt. The price was low because the building needed work and nobody wanted the liability of the asbestos removal. Everybody said it was a bad investment. I bought it anyway. I had spent 3 years reading library books about commercial real estate, the same way I had taught myself plumbing, electrical basics, drywall patching. I hired the remediation company. I did what I could myself on weekends. I found a property manager and rented the units to a dentist, a chiropractor, a pediatric therapist. The income from that building paid for Adrian's private school from 6th grade through 12th. Adrian thought we had a benefactor, a scholarship program, something. I let him believe that because I wanted him to understand that you work for what you earn. I was afraid if he knew, he would stop working. He was so talented. I could not risk making him soft. I see now that I made a different mistake entirely. After the graduation, I did not hear from Adrian for 9 days. On the 10th day, he called. His voice was careful, the way it gets when he's managing me rather than talking to me. He said Celeste felt the situation had gotten out of hand, that there had been a miscommunication, that he hoped I understood. I said I understood perfectly. I asked when the wedding was. September 14th, he said. I wrote it on my calendar. Then I called an old contact of mine, a woman named Shirley Pace, who had handled background checks for the property management firm for years. Shirley was retired now, but she still took work from people she trusted. I told her what I needed. I told her I needed to know everything about Celeste Vaughn. Shirley called me back in 11 days. We met at a diner off Route 9, a place where the booths had high backs and nobody paid attention to anybody else. Shirley was 71, small, with reading glasses on a beaded chain and the kind of stillness that comes from decades of finding things people try to hide. She set a folder on the table between us. Celeste Vaughn, 29, graduate of Whitmore University, currently working as a practice manager at a dermatology clinic in Fairfield, clean employment history on the surface, but underneath, Shirley tapped the folder. Celeste had a former business partner, a woman named Dana Cho, with whom she had co-founded a wellness startup in 2020. The company dissolved in 2022 after Dana filed a civil complaint alleging that Celeste had diverted operating funds, approximately $190,000, into a personal account during the final months of the business. The complaint was settled out of court. Non-disclosure agreement. Celeste had paid Dana back a portion, enough to make the lawsuit go away, but not everything. That was not the worst of it. Shirley turned to a second page. Celeste had accessed Adrian's medical school loan accounts 4 months ago using his login credentials. She had not withdrawn money. She had inquired about consolidation options, about disbursement schedules, about what happened to loan balances in the event of a borrower's death. She had been mapping his finances. Shirley looked at me over her reading glasses. Your son has significant student debt plus his future earning potential. She paused. Someone did the math on him, Nora. I sat with that for a moment. He doesn't know? I asked. I don't believe so, she said. I picked up my coffee cup, set it down without drinking. I thought about my son at 22, studying at the kitchen table of our Clover Street apartment, anatomy textbook propped open against his cereal box. I thought about how I had mopped floors on Christmas Eve so he could have his application fees covered. I thought about the security guard and the clipboard and the navy dress. What do I do with this? I asked. That depends, Shirley said, on whether you want to protect him or punish her. I thought about it for a long moment. Both, I said, but protect him first. I did not call Adrian. I knew he would not believe me. He had been with Celeste for 3 years. He thought she was organized, focused, driven. He admired those things in her. If I told him now, she would call me jealous, controlling, a bitter woman who could not let go of her son. He would apologize to her in front of me, and I would become the problem. I had seen this before, not in my own life, but in the lives of women I worked with at the hospital. The moment you tell a man in love that the woman he loves is wrong, he stops hearing you. You become the obstacle. So I did not call. I planned. The first thing I did was contact the property management firm. I asked them to pull the booking records for the Hartwell Grand Pavilion, the venue Adrian and Celeste had chosen for the wedding reception. I had a reason for asking. I owned the building. I had purchased the Hartwell Grand Pavilion in 2018 when the previous events company failed. It sat on 2 acres and the better part of Claiborne, hardwood floors, vaulted ceiling, a commercial kitchen, a patio with string lights over a garden. My property manager, a man named Roy Simmons, had been booking it as an event venue ever since. It ran well. It turned a profit. Adrian had chosen it with Celeste because it was elegant, because it had been featured in 2 wedding magazines, because standing in that pavilion made a person feel like they had arrived somewhere. He did not know his mother's initials were on the deed. I asked Roy to hold any future modifications to the wedding booking pending further notice. He asked why. I told him the situation had changed. He did not ask again. The second thing I did was contact a former colleague, not a custodian, a hospital attorney I had spoken to years ago when the hospital had a workers' compensation dispute. Her name was Frances Nkosi, and she had remembered me because I was the only cleaning staff member who had ever sat down with her to go over the paperwork myself rather than leaving it to a union rep. She owed me nothing, but she took my call. I explained the situation without mentioning my assets. I told her my son was about to marry a woman who had accessed his financial accounts without permission and who had a history of diverting business funds. I asked what the legal exposure looked like. Frances was quiet for a moment. Then she said, unauthorized access to financial accounts is a civil matter at minimum, potentially criminal depending on what she did with the information. The business dispute, if provable, adds to the picture. She paused. You need to document everything before the wedding. After vows, asset protection becomes significantly more complicated. I already have documentation, I said. Get it to the right people before September 14th, she said. I thanked her and hung up. I had 6 weeks. In those 6 weeks, I did 3 things. I met with a family law attorney in Claiborne, a man named Grant Pickford who had a reputation for being thorough and not theatrical. I gave him Shirley's folder. He read through it twice, asked clarifying questions, and told me that the civil complaint and the financial account access, taken together, formed a credible pattern. He said there was enough here for a fraud consultant to take seriously. He asked me what outcome I was seeking. I want my son protected, I said. I want him to see what he's walking into before he walks into it, and I want her to know I know. He nodded slowly. Then he said, "Be at the reception." I told him what happened at the graduation. He said, "Be at the reception anyway. Let me handle the rest." 3 days before the wedding, I called Adrian. He sounded surprised to hear from me, cautiously pleased in the way of someone who has been feeling guilty about something but doesn't want to discuss it. I did not mention the graduation. I told him I had a gift for him and Celeste. I told him I needed 15 minutes of his time. He said he was busy with final preparations. I said I understood. I told him the gift was something he would want to know about before the ceremony. He agreed to meet me the next morning at the coffee shop near his apartment. I brought one thing with me, a single document, a property summary from NLM Holdings, not the full portfolio, just one property, the Hartwell Grand Pavilion with my name listed as sole owner through the LLC. I set it on the table between us. Adrian picked it up and read it once. Then again, his coffee sat untouched. "You own the venue," he said. It was not a question. "I own the venue," I said. "I have owned it since 2018. I purchased it when the previous company went under." He looked up at me. "Why didn't you tell me?" I looked at my son. He looked so much like his father in that moment, the same careful eyes, the same way of going still when something didn't fit the picture he had in his head. His father had been a good man who died too young. Adrian had inherited his father's caution and his father's tendency to see the best in people until proven otherwise. I said, "Because I wanted to see who you would become without knowing what I had. I wanted to know if you were choosing your life or if someone was choosing it for you." He frowned. "What does that mean?" I reached into my folder and set down Shirley's report. Not all of it. 3 pages. The civil complaint from Dana Cho. The account access records with dates and timestamps. Adrian read slowly. I watched his face change the way a room changes when the light goes out. "This can't be right," he said. I said nothing. He looked up. "She told me the business failed because her partner was unstable. She told me Dana was vindictive." "I know what she told you," I said. He pushed back from the table slightly. "This is why you set this up. The venue. You're trying to—" "I'm not trying to stop your wedding," I said. "I'm trying to make sure you know who you're marrying before you marry her." He sat there for a long time. The coffee shop hummed around us. A mother at the next table was cutting a muffin into pieces for a small child. Outside, a delivery truck rumbled past. Adrian said, "I need to talk to her." I said, "I know." I said, "I'll be at the reception tomorrow," not to cause a scene. "Because I am your mother and you graduated from medical school and I missed it, and I will not miss your wedding." He didn't argue. That told me something. The wedding ceremony was held at St. Brendan's Church, 3 miles from the Hartwell Grand Pavilion. I was not invited to the ceremony either, and this time I did not attempt to attend. I sat in the parking lot of a diner across the street and drank a cup of tea and waited. At 4:30, I drove to the pavilion and walked in through the service entrance. Roy had left a key for me. I stood for a moment in the back hallway, listening to the caterers setting up in the main room, glasses clinking, someone adjusting a microphone. The string lights were all in over the garden. The room looked exactly the way a room looks when someone has spent a great deal of money trying to make everything perfect. I found a seat at a table near the back, next to an elderly couple I didn't recognize who turned out to be Celeste's great-uncle and his wife from Ohio. They were friendly. They offered me a dinner roll. I accepted. The bridal party arrived at 6. I watched Celeste move through the room. She was good at this, moving through a room. She stopped at each table, tilted her head when people spoke, laughed at the right moments. She had a talent for making people feel attended to. I could see why Adrian had fallen for her. I could see why it had taken 3 years to see past it. She did not notice me until cocktail hour. When she did, her expression moved through several things very quickly. Surprise. Then calculation. Then something that settled into a bright, controlled smile. She crossed the room toward me with her hands extended like we were old friends. "Nora," she said warmly, "you made it." I shook her hands. "Congratulations," I said. She leaned in slightly, still smiling. I have to say, I'm a little surprised. After everything, I smiled back. I thought about this moment for 6 weeks. I decided I wouldn't miss it. Something moved behind her eyes, not fear, not yet, just awareness that the conversation was not going the way she expected. Adrian appeared at her shoulder. His face was unreadable in the careful way of someone trying very hard to stay even. He kissed my cheek. He held on for one moment longer than usual. I squeezed his arm and let him go. Dinner was served at 7, toasts at 8. Adrian's best man told a story about medical school that made everyone laugh. Celeste's maid of honor cried in a genuine way. Adrian looked at his new wife the way he'd looked at everything he ever loved, with that same focused attention that had made him a good student and would make him a good doctor. I sat at my table and ate my salmon and thought about the 30 years that had brought us to this room. At 8:40, Grant Pickford walked through the main entrance. He was not dressed like an attorney. He was dressed like a wedding guest. Dark suit, no tie. He scanned the room once, found me, and gave a small nod. Beside him was a woman I had not met but recognized from a photograph Grant had sent me. Diane Holbrook, a fraud consultant who had spent 12 years with the Financial Crimes Division of the State Attorney General's office. She specialized in civil fraud cases and asset protection. She had agreed as a professional courtesy to Grant to be present. They sat down at a table near the door. Celeste noticed them at 9:15. I was watching her when it happened. She was standing near the bar with her maid of honor, and she happened to glance toward the entrance and something in her face shifted. Not dramatically, just a slight change in the set of her jaw, the way a person looks when they recognize a face they were not expecting to see. She excused herself from her friend. She walked toward Grant's table. I stood up and walked the same direction from the other side. We arrived at the same moment. Grant stood and extended his hand. "Congratulations, Mrs. Moss-Fawn. I'm Grant Pickford. I represent Nora Moss in a matter related to NLM Holdings, which, as you may now be aware, is the entity that owns this venue." Celeste's smile was still in place, but it had changed quality. It was doing more work now. She turned to me. "Nora, what is this?" I said, "This is a conversation we should have had before tonight." Diane Holbrook set a folder on the table. She did not introduce herself yet. She just let the folder sit there. Celeste looked at it. She looked at it. She looked at Grant. She looked at me. "Where is Adrian?" she asked. "Behind you," said Adrian. He had been standing 6 feet away. I had not seen him approach. He looked at his wife with the same expression he'd had at the coffee shop the morning before. Careful. Sad. Fully awake. Celeste turned to face him. She started to say something, stopped. Grant spoke quietly. "We have documentation of unauthorized access to Dr. Moss's financial accounts on 4 separate dates between January and April of this year. We also have records related to a civil settlement involving a former business partner that was not disclosed prior to this marriage. Diane Holbrook, beside me, is a fraud consultant retained to review the asset exposure." Celeste said, "This is insane. This is my wedding." Adrian said, "I know what you did with Dana's money." The words were quiet, not angry, just clear, the way a diagnosis is clear. "This is what it is. We need to talk about it." Celeste looked around the room. The guests at nearby tables had not yet noticed. The DJ was playing something with a steady bass that absorbed the conversation. She had, for a moment, the option of making a scene. I watched her calculate. She chose not to. That surprised me a little. It told me she was smarter than she was reckless. She said, "I want to speak to Adrian privately." Grant said, "Of course." Adrian turned to me before he followed her. He held my gaze for a moment. Then he said quietly, "Why didn't you just tell me earlier?" I said, "Would you have heard me?" He didn't answer. He followed his wife through a side door onto the garden patio where the string lights were reflected in the wet grass from an earlier rain. Grant and Diane and I sat down at the table. The wedding reception continued around us. The DJ moved into something slower. A few couples drifted to the dance floor. I picked up my water glass and looked out toward the patio door. 32 minutes later, Adrian came back in alone. He walked directly to our table. He sat down next to me. He looked like a man who had just seen something very clearly for the first time and was not sure yet whether to be grateful or devastated. He was probably both. He said, she admitted it, about Dana, about the accounts. He paused. She said she was going to pay it back. The money from Dana. She said she was going to use... He stopped. He shook his head. I put my hand over his. He said she was going to use the accounts she'd mapped. Mine. She was building a plan. I know, I said. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, through the glass doors, I could see Celeste standing alone on the patio, her veil catching the wind from a passing car. She's not a bad person, Adrian said. But he said it the way people say things they are not sure they believe. I said, she made choices. Those choices have consequences. That's different from being bad or good. He looked at me. 30 years ago, he said, you started buying buildings when I was in first grade. I said, the first one was the spring you learned to read. He smiled a little, just barely. He shook his head. All those nights, he said, you were mopping floors at 2 a.m. I used to call you on your break. You always picked up. Always, I said. He looked at the table. Then he looked up at me with his father's eyes. I should have come outside at the graduation, he said. I said nothing. I just kept my hand over his. After that night, things moved the way difficult things move when you have good people around you. Slowly, with paperwork without drama. Celeste and Adrian did not file for divorce immediately. That surprised some people and did not surprise me. The situation was complicated by the financial issues, by what she had accessed and what she had planned, by what Dana Cho was now willing to revisit given new documentation. Diane Holbrook connected Adrian with the right attorneys. Grant handled the property-related matters. I stayed out of it, unless I was asked directly. Celeste moved out of the apartment they had shared in November. I am told she is doing better, that she's in therapy, that she's making arrangements to fully repay Dana Cho. I do not wish her ill. I wish her a reckoning and then a path forward. Those are not the same thing. Adrian moved back to Clover Street for 3 months. Not to my apartment. To the building across the courtyard, the one I had purchased in 2003 without telling anyone. He paid me rent. He insisted. I let him because he needed to. In January, I sat down with him at my kitchen table with a cup of tea that had gone cold and a folder I had been waiting a long time to open. Inside was the full portfolio, 11 properties, current valuation, income statements, the trust structure I had established in his name in 2009, the one that had been accruing quietly for 14 years. He read through it without speaking. He turned each page carefully. I watched his face do what faces do when a person's entire understanding of their history shifts into a different shape. Finally, he set the folder down. He said, "How?" I said, "The same way you learned medicine. One thing at a time for a very long time." He said, "You mopped floors." I said, "I still mop floors. I like my job. I know what it is and I know what it's worth, and nobody's opinion of it has ever changed that." He looked at me for a long moment. He said, "I told the guard to step aside at the graduation. After Celeste went in, I went back out to the parking lot, but you were already gone." I looked at him. "I looked for you," he said, "for 20 minutes. I should have called." I said, "You should have." He nodded. He did not make excuses. I was glad. "What do you want me to do with all this?" he asked, meaning the portfolio, the trust, the years of it. I told him what I told him. "I want you to learn it the way I learned it. I want you to understand where it came from, what it cost, what it's for. And then I want you to decide what to do with your portion when it comes to you, because it will come to you and I want you ready." "What's it for?" he asked. I picked up my tea. I thought about Sandra Torres and the diner in Claiborne and the strip mall on Prentice Avenue and the overnight shift and the ICU floors at 2 in the morning and the young security guard and his clipboard. "It's for exactly what you think it's for," I said. "You're a doctor now. You know what this hospital needs. You know which neighborhoods don't have a clinic. You know which kids can't get a pediatric appointment within 40 miles. He was quiet. I said, "Your grandmother worked in a canning factory for 31 years. She saved $63 a week and she never complained once. She would have liked to see you become a doctor. She would have liked to see what we're going to build." Adrian was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I want to help. Not just with the money. With the work. With the decisions." I slid a second folder across the table. I said, "I was hoping you'd say that." Inside was the preliminary plan for a community health clinic in Ridgeway, the neighborhood where I had grown up, where the nearest urgent care was 11 miles away, where mothers drove sick children to an emergency room because there was nowhere else. I had been sitting on the plan for 4 years, waiting for the right partner. Adrian read it slowly. I watched him read it the same way he had read his textbooks at the kitchen table when he was 22. That same focused attention, that same quality of presence. He turned the last page and looked up. "When do we start?" he said. He said, "Soon," I said. He nodded. He looked around my kitchen, the small table, the window with the parking lot view, the same calendar I had used for 30 years, with dates circled in red. "I have a question," he said. I waited. "Why did you stay in this apartment? You could live anywhere." I set my cup down. I thought about it the honest way, not the way that sounds good. "Because this is where I made the decisions," I said. "This is where I sat with the library books and the property maps and the bad coffee and figured out what was possible. You can't be somebody different in a bigger kitchen. You're still the same person." He smiled. "The real kind." I said, "When I'm ready to move, I'll know." He said, "Okay." We sat there for a while. The radiator clicked on. Outside, February had gone dark early and the parking lot lights were coming on one by one. Adrian said, "Can I ask you something else?" I said yes. He said, "Were you scared when you bought the first building, when you started all of this?" I thought about 1997, the foreclosure notice, the asbestos, the library books, the savings account with $9,000 in it that represented 3 years of overtime and eating sandwiches from home and not buying new shoes until the soles gave out. "Yes," I said, "every time. It doesn't go away. You just learn to act anyway." He nodded slowly, like he was filing it somewhere useful. I picked up the community health clinic folder and set it in front of him. "So," I said, "let's get to work." Outside, the parking lot lights held steady against the February dark. The radiator hummed. My son turned to the first page and picked up his pen. We had a lot of ground to cover, and we were only just beginning. I have been thinking about cause and effect for most of my adult life. Not the dramatic kind you see in movies, where one moment changes everything in an instant. The quiet kind, the kind that builds over decades in the spaces between decisions nobody else sees you making. When Celeste told that security guard I wasn't on the list, she thought she was making a small move. Keeping the optics clean. Keeping her wedding photos free of a woman in a department store dress who mopped floors for a living. What she didn't understand was that every small move lands somewhere. It doesn't disappear, it accumulates. And eventually, the accumulation becomes the story. That's the thing I wish I could go back and tell my younger self. Not that people will treat you badly. I already knew that. But that what you do in response to being treated badly is the most important choice you will ever make. I could have called Adrian that night from the parking lot. I could have cried. I could have made it about the wound instead of about the truth. But wounds close. Truth stays. I spent 27 years being invisible at that hospital. I know what it does to a person, being looked through instead of at. Some people collapse under it. Some people get angry in ways that eat them from the inside. I did something different, though I wouldn't have called it wisdom at the time. I just kept my head down and paid attention. I watched which properties sat empty too long. I read the financial pages in the library on my lunch break. I learned to see value where other people saw liability. That is a skill. It is also, I think, a form of character, because it requires you to believe that the future is worth building even when nobody around you agrees. Adrian asked me once if I was scared. Every time, I told him, every single time. Scared doesn't mean wrong. Scared means you're paying attention to what's at stake. What I see now, looking back at everything that happened with Celeste and the graduation and the night at the pavilion, is that consequences are not punishment, they are information. Celeste's choices told her who she was becoming. Adrian's silence outside that auditorium told him something too. Not about being a bad son, about what happens when you let someone else's comfort determine your behavior. He learned it. That matters more to me than the graduation ever could have. My mother worked in a canning factory for 31 years. She saved money in a coffee tin under the sink. She never once described her work as beneath her because she understood something I have spent my whole life trying to pass on. The dignity in a thing is not assigned by whoever's watching. It lives in the doing. It lives in the person who shows up, does the work, and goes home with something real to show for it. Adrian is building a clinic now in Ridgeway. He calls me on Tuesday evenings to go over the plans. Last week, he asked about the zoning restrictions on the corner lot. I knew the answer because I had been watching that corner for 4 years. That's what I want people to take from this. Not that secrets are good, or that silence is always the right strategy. I made mistakes. I held things too close for too long, and it nearly cost me my son. But what I never did was stop building. I never let being overlooked convince me that I wasn't worth something. I never waited for someone else to tell me what was possible. You don't need permission to build something real. You just need to start. Keep going when it's hard, and trust that the accumulation means something. It always does.